Hi everyone, thanks for being here. My name is Whitney Albright and I'm with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'm going to be talking about the biodiversity and habitat sector as it relates to the plan update. I thought that I would start off with just a really quick reminder of the importance of maintaining healthy ecosystems and habitats and species populations. So healthy and functioning ecosystems support the ecological processes that provide us with a variety of benefits like clean air, clean water, recreational opportunities like hunting and fishing and wildlife viewing. And biodiversity resources also play a part in the cultural heritage of a lot of different communities. So these are just some of the ecosystem goods and services that California residents have come to enjoy, and this is what's at risk from potentially negative impacts of climate change. So what we want to do is make sure that we build off of the existing climate change planning efforts and work in this sector and come up with some really robust strategies and actions that we can take to help us continue moving forward and make sure that we're protecting and preserving these resources and these services. Ecosystems are subject to a number of different stresses that we're managing for every day. There's pollution, habitat fragmentation, diseases, invasive species. And climate change is yet another stressor on top of all of these others. And climate change will interact with these existing stressors in different ways, often exacerbating them. And so unfortunately, this added pressure from climate change is increasing the risk of biodiversity loss and species extinction. Now, we do currently manage for a lot of different threats and stressors, and climate change is yet another risk that together we can tackle. We are already starting to see some impacts to biodiversity across the landscape. These are just a few recent observations. Species range shift. There are some plant and animal species distributions that have slightly shifted in elevation compared to where they occur historically. We're seeing that in some forests in the Sierra Nevada and also with some small mammal species populations in Yosemite National Park. Butterflies in the Central Valley are appearing earlier than they have historically as compared with the past few decades. Increasing temperatures and reduced upwelling are having impacts on the marine food web. That's also resulted in some impacts to fall-run Chinook salmon abundance. We've also seen climate impacting auklet breeding and sea lion pup mortality in the marine environment. And these, again, are just a few examples, and they're discussed in more detail in the Indicators of Climate Change in California report that was mentioned earlier that came out in August. So given those observations, there are a few kind of major challenges and potential impacts that we're trying to plan for and actively address in this sector. The first, as I mentioned, is species migration. So different plants and animals may potentially shift their distributions in response to changing climatic conditions. And this may be more difficult for some species than others depending on different barriers to movement across the landscape. We're also expecting that some vegetative communities may kind of disassemble and reassemble in new and novel ways, and this could result in some species interactions that we haven't seen before. Changes in the timing of seasonal life cycle events, so climate change can cause a mismatch in timing of things like migration and food availability and breeding and how those all work together. Food web disruptions. Climate change can impact an individual species, but that can then ripple through the food web and cause impacts to a wider range of organisms. Climate change could also support the spread of pathogens, parasites, and disease with potentially serious effects for human health, agriculture, it was just mentioned, and fisheries. And then finally, as I mentioned before, climate change could cause added pressure that increases our risk of species loss and extinction. So these are just some of the sort of major challenges and risks that we're trying to address in this sector. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about some recent activities that have been undertaken to help species and habitats adapt to or prepare for these risks from climate change. And California has really made a lot of important progress in preparing for these risks to biodiversity. And what I'm going to share with you is just a very small sampling of some of those efforts and recent accomplishments. There's a ton of work that's being conducted by a number of different organizations, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg. So first off, there have been a lot of efforts on creating visions and sort of collective approaches for how we address climate change in this sector. One of those at a very broad scale is the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, which was released earlier this year. And that strategy is a comprehensive, multi-partner response to the threat of climate change in the U.S. And it was developed collaboratively between state and federal agencies and the tribes. We've also developed our own vision for confronting climate change in California within the department, and that was released in 2011. And this really builds off of the 2009 adaptation strategy, but we dig a little bit deeper into the sector and also discuss some of the existing tools and the programs that we have that are going to help us meet the strategies and the goals and objectives that we've set for the sector. There's also been a lot of research on climate change impacts to biodiversity that's been conducted by a number of different organizations over the past several years. One was mentioned earlier, the state's third climate change assessment. That included a lot of different reports on impacts to and vulnerabilities of species in California. The Landscape Conservation Cooperatives in California, or the LCCs, have supported a lot of different research in this area. The California LCC in particular has been putting a really strong emphasis on projects that make that connection between the science and management application, which is really important. And we've also seen a big increase in the number of climate change vulnerability assessments that have come out in the last few years. The Department of Fish and Wildlife here conducted an assessment on a subset of rare plants in California, and that was supported by the California LCC. We also teamed up with Point Blue Conservation Science to develop an assessment on bird species of special concern in the state. And currently underway is an assessment of amphibians and reptiles in California that's being carried out with UC Davis and should be out by the end of the year. We've also taken some big steps to integrate climate change into different management and planning efforts. One example that we have currently going on is the revision of our State Wildlife Action Plan, and incorporating climate change impacts and strategies is really a high priority for that project throughout the whole revision process. We're also beginning to see more and more examples of adaptation in action on the ground. This is one example from ELKHORN Slough, where they're actively monitoring for climate impacts in the slough. They're also planning for sea level rise. They had a recent restoration project where they're building up the marsh, taking the different sea level rise projections into account in that area. And lastly, there have been a lot of different educational initiatives that have been carried out since the 2009 adaptation strategy was released. A lot of different agencies are undertaking these efforts, and this is an example of one of those. The DFW Climate College was an attempt to provide a really basic climate education for all of our staff throughout this 10-month lecture series. You can see the main course components listed there. And really the goal of this course was to try and empower our staff to be able to think about climate change and what it means for their work on a day-to-day basis. That course wrapped in June of 2013, and we are currently planning the second iteration of the Climate College, which will be topically focused on marine and climate change issues with a tribal component. So that was a pretty quick overview, but hopefully it gives you a general sense of some of the activities that are taking place in the sector to plan for climate change. And I wanted to flash this up here one last time before I wrap up. It's just a reminder of some of the major challenges that we're facing. So this can kind of inform our discussion as we're figuring out how best to continue moving forward. That's all I have. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback. Any questions? Please introduce yourself also.
Good morning. Mark Rentz, Integrated Natural Resource Management. Actually, it's a question for all the panelists, but since you're the first out of the chute that has brought up the issues of, regulatory action stuff you're going to have to take. The question I have for the panelists, I think we're all getting a pretty good hand on, though it continues to evolve, the risks and the challenges associated with climate change. But the policy question I have for you is part of your evaluation of that, are you also assessing existing laws and regulations and how those might have to be modified over time to provide you all the flexibility you need as regulatory agencies to address a situation that was not even conceived of when those laws were passed 40 years ago? I'd be interested in knowing that, especially when I saw the outline layout that talks about sections. I understand the stratification and why they're broken out like that, but I'm wondering how you talk about the laws and policies that overlap those sections and it will influence more than one section. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about that, and possibly if other panelists have ideas they can share along the line, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
I think actually Ann Shan, our Deputy Secretary, wants to address that. specifically?
Am I mic'd? Yeah, sounds like I am. So I'll try and tackle that a little bit. As part of the third California Climate Change Assessment, which is posted online, there was actually an assessment that was done about legal barriers and other hurdles, and part of that was starting the hard work of taking a look at existing authorities and seeing where things matched up, where more work might need to be done. It's our belief that a lot can be accomplished through existing laws, and of course we'll have to work within those frameworks since they are our laws, but we also understand that we may need new authorities, and so we are definitely looking at that question.
You know, that's something that we're, okay, so there's a question about the value of ecosystem services, and is that, you know, informing this discussion. And that's something that we are certainly thinking about as we work on the research plan that's being developed, you know, kind of in complementary to this strategy and others, that we are having that conversation of how do we, you know, put the value on that and really help make the case for maintaining ecosystems and making that part of our agenda. So it's something that we're thinking about. I'm not sure in terms of the research that's already been conducted. I know there is some, but it is something that we're talking about.
I'll jump in again just to say there are a couple of different research efforts. Whitney just referenced one of them. There's a plan, there's a movement or an effort afoot to put together a state research plan that describes the state's needs both around reducing greenhouse gases and also adapting to climate risks. There's also an effort to start the scoping for a fourth climate change assessment, and we know that continued resource economic studies that do evaluation of ecosystem services continues to be a need in the state.
Hi, Sandy with Food and Ag. I wanted to mention that so Food and Ag is a science farming science panel, and they've been working on ecosystem services for almost 2 years now. I encourage you guys to go to the Department of Food and Ag's website. We have hundreds of farms where we've done a qualitative ecosystem services analysis for the benefits that different activities provide, from habitat to cleaner water and other activities.
Alex Lunar from Nature Conservancy. That actually kind of leads into my question. I'm wondering how a lot of these cross-sectoral issues are going to be addressed, because there's clearly, I mean, just in these two presentations, there's clearly a lot of overlap. So since these are broken down into different sectors in the report, I'm curious how, you know, all these different topics that might range, you know, over 3 or 4 different chapters are going to be tied together.
So I'll take that question. The folks that you see sitting up on those dais are actually part of a cross-sector working group. So we are developing content around each of the sectors, but we're also in close coordination with one another to talk about those cross-sectoral linkages. We will also have, I imagine, a cross-cutting recommendation section as well. That is the fruition of the conversations that we have going on between our various sector leads here.
Any other questions?
I do have one comment from the web. Someone wanted to provide some input that that invasive species are also another major stressor or challenge, both on their own and in combination with climate change, and are hoping that will be addressed in the chapter.
Thank you.